Hello and welcome to the Sidebar presented by True Crime News, taking you inside the courtrooms of high-profile and notorious cases from across the country. I'm your host, Joshua Ritter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer based in Los Angeles and previously an LA County prosecutor for a decade. We are recording this on Friday, July 25th, 2024. In this week's episode, a mother stands accused of stabbing her firefighter husband to death while two of the couple's adult children were in the home. Plus, a teenager charged with shooting her mother faces trial as an adult and will now also face full media scrutiny after a judge's ruling to allow cameras in the courtroom. But first, prosecutors rest their case against a former ballerina charged with a fatal shooting of her estranged husband as she takes the stand in her own defense. This week, I am flying solo, so bear with me as we try to get through these cases. All of them are very interesting, and you will see, I think that we have a theme that runs throughout that we will talk about. So let's first move to Manatee County, Florida, where prosecutors rested their case against a woman charged with her husband's murder, as the former ballerina's defense contends the slaying was an act of self-preservation. Ashley Benefield faces one count of second-degree murder for the fatal shooting of her estranged husband, Doug Benefield. Ashley's defense maintains that Doug was abusive and charged her moments before she shot him. Prosecutors argued Benefield gunned down her estranged husband in a last-ditch effort to maintain sole possession of the couple's daughter. The pair had been engaged in a prolonged custody debate at the time of the incident. Rounding out the state's case, medical examiner Dr. Russell Vega testified about his autopsy of Mr. Benefield and the 3 shot wounds suffered by the man before his death. Both sides sparred over the fatal wound to the man's chest, debating the positioning of the shooter at the time of the deadly blow, with Dr. Vega testifying that the assailant was likely in front of the victim, but off to one side. Before arresting, prosecutors presented text messages between the husband and wife that seemed to demonstrate cordial communication just minutes before the shooting. The defense began their case on Friday morning with Ashley taking the stand in her own defense. Benefield's testimony has been highly emotional as she struggled through tears to recount the systematic abuse she claimed to have suffered at the hands of her estranged husband. At the time we are recording this, she is continuing her testimony and the prosecution has not yet started their cross-examination. All right. Well, I think this case gives us a great opportunity to discuss the difference between self-defense and battered spouse syndrome or a battered spouse defense. And they're kind of cousin defenses to each other. The arguments are very similar, but it really comes down to a question of reasonableness and immediacy. In self-defense, it's required that the person act reasonable in response to what is perceived as a reasonable threat to their own life, and they don't use any more force in response to that than is necessary or reasonable under the circumstances. So you can see this idea of reasonableness works throughout. But it's also the idea of immediacy, the idea that you were under imminent threat and that you had to act immediately to defend yourself, which is different from battered spouse syndrome, where the claim is being made that it was a systematic, pervasive abuse that put this person in constant fear. So it wasn't some act in the moment, but it was a general environment that created this fear where the person, the defendant, felt that they had to respond and defend themselves. And that's why you will oftentimes see this defense when there is not as much evidence of them being attacked, the defendant being attacked moments before. Another big difference between the two is that self-defense is what we call a complete defense. It makes it a justified homicide. And in battered spouse syndrome or defense, it's more seen as a mitigating defense. In other words, it's not the question being posed to the jury is not entirely that this person's homicide is justified, but that the intent required for, say, a second-degree murder should be mitigated to something down to a manslaughter. The other thing to keep in mind is that with these defenses, you often see what we call a shifting of burdens, where the burden always rests on the prosecution. They have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. But when the defense is raising something which is called an affirmative defense, like self-defense, there is some burden on them. They do have to prove to a certain extent to the jury some burden of proof. And if they reach that, then the prosecution has to respond to it or eliminate beyond a reasonable doubt that there was any evidence of self-defense. I know this is very confusing or can be confusing, and we're getting a little bit into the weeds here, but I think it's important to understand when considering these types of cases, because you will see how defense attorneys try to use them in tandem with each other. The defense in this case, in Benefield's case, is saying she was suffering from systematic abuse, that she was living in an environment where she was constantly in fear, and that he had abused her or created a hostile, fearful environment for her. And that's important to understand to appreciate her actions in the moment. And then they're still trying to say that in the moment he was attacking her or aggressive with her, but it might explain why she was attacking someone with a gun when that person, the victim, Doug in this case, was not armed himself. Again, in a more traditional self-defense type situation, that would be a much more difficult argument to make. But in this case, they have the backdrop of saying that she was suffering from an environment, a history, a systematic cycle of abuse. The other thing that you oftentimes see in these cases is the defendant testifying. So it's no shock to me whatsoever that Ashley Benefield did take the stand in her own defense in this case, because it's almost as if she is left without really any other options. There's no eyewitness to what took place. The children, or actually there was no one else present, so there was no witness to any of this. So she has to explain to jurors, either through circumstantial evidence, the forensic evidence, the ballistic evidence, the autopsy reports, how it may have appeared to be self-defense. But if that's not enough, then she's going to have to take the stand to testify what was happening in those moments. And it's going to be up to jurors to believe her. And how impactful will her testimony be on this case? To me, in my view, in these situations, it is the entire case. This case boils down to how she performs on the stand today and under cross-examination, especially, if not more so, by the prosecution. Jurors can hear all sorts of eyewitness testimony and forensic testimony and character evidence. But if the defendant takes the stand and in their own words appears to be less than honest with them, their veracity comes into question. They are perhaps even lying about small things. Many times you see jurors hang the entire case on that testimony. And if they don't feel that the defendant is being truthful with them, then they're not going to believe, quite frankly, any of the other evidence presented. That is at least my experience. That's why when I was a prosecutor, I encouraged the defendant to take the stand, because I know what an incredible tight wire act it can be for them to be able to testify honestly about everything in a way that's convincing to the jury. So again, we will continue to watch this case, keep a close eye on it, and update you. It's a fascinating case that's getting a lot of media attention, and I think the reasons for that have a lot to do with what we've just discussed. Moving on to our next case out of Plymouth, Massachusetts, where you're dealing with many of the same circumstances and themes, at least. The facts themselves are different, but the themes are very similar. In another case of a wife charged with her husband's murder, a mother claims that her partner was enraged in the throes of a mental health episode when he became violent. Christine Ricci, not to be confused with the actress Christina Ricci, was accused of fatally stabbing her firefighter husband, Michael Ricci. The trial began last week with her adult children testifying about the couple's tenuous marriage. The mental health of both the defendant and the victim will come into play as prosecutors claim Ricci's mental state deteriorated following her discovery of her husband's infidelity, eventually causing Ricci to stab her husband with a kitchen knife in a heated argument. Ricci's defense, meanwhile, maintains that Mr. Ricci, had been in a multi-day manic episode when he attacked her, alleging the woman had only brandished the knife to scare the man, never intending to kill her husband. Two of Ricci's children were the first witnesses to take the stand, testifying about their parents' continuous arguments in the wake of Mr. Ricci's affair and their father's chronic drinking. However, at the time of the stabbing, he had been sober for over 2 years. Prior to his death, Mr. Ricci served as a firefighter for 23 years, and the couple shared 3 children together, 2 of whom were in the home when the couple's marriage ended in bloodshed. So again, we see these themes arising in this case about a battered spouse, history of violence, and the need to defend oneself in the moment. I think this case is a little more straightforward as far as it goes towards being much more of a pure self-defense argument. As we're seeing this case play out, she's claiming that he lunged at her and she only had to defend herself in the moment. And I'll talk a little bit about the weapon and why I feel like that's important in this case. But first, I wanted to talk about how the prosecutors chose to open their case with the 2 adult children. And that's an interesting strategy. Obviously, the children are emotionally torn in this whole situation. And they have seen their father, who sounds like he was a very nice man to them. There's been accounts of how, a loving a man he was, at least to his children. But then they also have their mother on trial for murder. And again, we find ourselves in one of these tragic situations where this act of violence is likely going to cause these children to lose both of their parents. And that tragedy we see come up time and time again. But why do you think the prosecutors chose to call the children early? Well, I think a couple of things might be happening here. One, I think the prosecution wants to make sure that the children were their witnesses. They don't, first of all, want to be afraid of calling them. Even if they are perhaps more friendly to the defense in this case, they want to make sure that they are able to address that in their own control. And then I think calling them early may address whatever emotional damage it does to the prosecution's case by calling them early than finishing their case, perhaps with much more, hard science type of testimony. Again, I'm just doing my best to understand what the prosecution is doing. They have not said publicly why it was that they called the children first. But I think it also then does establish, as best as the prosecution can, what the environment was like inside of that home, and being able to address that up front in attacking what they know will be the defense's strategy of a self-defense, battered spouse type defense in this case. Now, one thing that I think is remarkably different here, there are many differences, not just to say anytime a wife allegedly murders her husband, we're always going to be talking about the exact same scenario. The theme may be the same, but the facts are always going to be different. And to me, one big difference between the Ricci case and the Benefield case is the choice of weapon. And I use those words carefully, choice. Because Benefield has testified to she went and grabbed a gun. And Ricci has not yet testified. I imagine, again, she will for the reasons we talked about before. But she picked up a steak knife. And to me, there is some argument to be made about the mental state of the choice between those 2 weapons. A knife, to me, lends itself more towards being an improvised weapon, grabbing whatever was handy. grabbing a fire poker, or a baseball bat or whatever happened to be handy, in this case, a steak knife, just simply to defend oneself. You already begin to see the mental picture of a person grabbing whatever they can in the moment, in the heat of the moment, to defend themselves, because it is a far more personal weapon. And I think as a steak knife, something that we think of being used in a more defensive manner. A gun is a little bit different, and it carries kind of a different connotation to it. Its only purpose is to kill whatever it's being pointed at. And yes, it can be used in defense 100%. I appreciate that. But I almost feel like there's a little more difficulty in arguing self-defense in the fact that Benefield chose to pick up a gun. I could be wrong here. I'm sure you guys will let us all know in the comments, but to me, that was something that was different and worth discussing. Another big difference is the idea of what mental health will play in this case. The fact that he was allegedly suffering, the victim, Mr. Ricci in this case, from a manic episode and had a history of mental health issues, certainly, on top of whatever domestic violence was taking place in that home, that again is going to be part of the backdrop, part of the surrounding circumstances in which jurors are going to have to judge her actions. Knowing her husband, knowing he suffers from mental health issues, and knowing he was experiencing a crisis at the time that she says was lasting for 3 days, that, again, if we're trying to get inside of her mind, which is what the jurors are going to be asked to do, that I think creates more of an argument of why she had to behave the way that she did in the moment. But my last comment on this is I would be shocked again if we don't see her take the stand. These cases almost require it because the mental state of the defendant at the time that this crime took place is really the most important question for jurors when you're talking about a case like this. They need to appreciate what was going through that person's head, because it quite frankly could be the difference between a guilty or a not guilty. Simply understanding why she behaved the way she did, and did she feel like she had to and reasonably had to under the circumstances. And we finally move on to Rankin County, Mississippi, where a teenager is facing adult charges for the shooting death of her mother, will now also face public scrutiny during the proceedings after a judge's ruling allowing media and the public in the courtroom. 14-year-old Carly Gregg will be tried as an adult after an alleged shooting that killed her mother, Ashley Smiley, and injured her stepfather. Denying a motion from Gregg's defense to exclude media and the public from the trial, Judge Dewey Arthur said, "This is the public's courtroom," adding, "The people of Rankin County own this court, nobody else. The court is not going to exclude the public." Ahead of trial, Gregg will undergo a mental health evaluation with a deadline set for the end of the week. In the meantime, Gregg remains behind bars in adult jail on a $1 million bond, and her trial is scheduled to begin September 16th. This case is just kind of awful. You're dealing with a 14-year-old. That's a child. I don't care any way you cut it. I don't care what the laws are on the books. That is a 14-year-old child whose brain has not fully developed. Now, each jurisdiction treats these cases differently. Some far more conservatively, some far more liberally. In the jurisdiction I practice in Los Angeles, in fact, the district attorney here has essentially made a bright line rule that he will not prosecute any minor, anyone below the age of 18 as an adult ever. You can criticize that if you feel that that's an appropriate way to handle it or not. But here, I feel like we are really pushing the envelope on the far end of extreme of as to how young a person can be before we charge them as an adult with murder. And there's a lot of other things at play here, aside from the fact that as an adult, she could be sentenced to adult time. We're talking, I imagine the punishment for murder in that jurisdiction includes a potential life sentence. So you're talking about putting a 14-year-old away for, if not the better part of their life, their entire life, based upon their actions at the time of 14. Now, this case, we don't know as many of the details behind it. We have not seen this trial play out. We don't know what the actions were behind any of this. And yes, someone did lose their life, and I'm not trying to diminish any of that. But again, we really have to closely analyze our decisions as a society when we're dealing with someone this young. And then there's the idea that because of being tried as an adult, she's, again, going to be treated as an adult in all respects when it comes to bail, $1 million bail, remaining in custody during all this time, not having the opportunity to meet with attorneys or therapists or other people to help a child through all of this. It really is heartbreaking. And I know that I'm speaking much about the defendant and the accused in this case. It's hard not to when you're talking about a 14-year-old. And I'm not trying to ignore or diminish the horrible act that she is alleged to have committed. Now let's turn to the judge's decision about allowing media in the courtroom. And again, here, I'm really torn. I am a big proponent of having cameras in the courtroom. I think that we live in a day and age where transparency is not only desired, but should be expected in these types of circumstances, especially when it comes to our criminal justice system. And it is one of the things that makes the system of justice that we have in this country a beautiful thing. Our courtrooms are open. You can walk into, unless it's under the most extreme of circumstances why they might close a courtroom, you can walk into almost any criminal courtroom in this country any day of the week and watch a trial. So they are open. The judge is right. The judge doesn't have the right to exclude the public. That is part of what makes our system great, is that we open it up and allow people to see how justice is actually done. But now we're getting into the question of what about the media and what about having cameras? Well, again, we're in 2024. I think cameras are kind of an expected element wherever anybody is allowed to go anyways. Now, not all of our justice system entirely agrees with that. The federal system doesn't allow cameras in courtroom. You'll find that in any federal case, all of those courtroom artists, the sketch artists, that's when they really make their big bucks, is when you have a federal trial, because they're the only ones allowed in to kind of depict the visuals of what it's like inside of the courthouse. And that's a rule that, from the top down, the Supreme Court doesn't allow cameras inside when they're presiding over a hearing. Again, we could talk about it being 2024, and maybe that the times are changing and they should change that. But those are the exception. The vast majority of courthouses, if they're open to the public, are also open to cameras. And it's up to each judge to decide under the circumstances whether or not they will allow that. And this judge has taken the position that he will allow it. And I would say, normally I applaud that. And normally I think that should be done. And yes, it's going to have an effect on the case. Yes, it's going to affect the way that people behave and the way that the attorneys act and the defendant acts and the jurors even understanding, especially in these high profile media cases that the world is watching. Is that the cost that we have to pay to have this transparency? I think so. But let's get to the idea that, again, we have a 14-year-old on trial here. A child. Many times, even with cameras in courtroom, if a child even takes the stand, we blur out that person's face and we'd refer to them as a John or Jane Doe. But now you have a 14-year-old who will, maybe be into their 15 years old by the time they're actually on trial, who's going to have cameras in the courtroom every single step of the way. Again, I'm not even saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's definitely worth having the conversation as far as is it appropriate when we're dealing with a minor? And I think that yes, sometimes the rules should be augmented and treated differently when we're dealing with a minor because their brain isn't fully developed and because they are so young and they still have their entire life ahead of them. And because we can understand the decisions and actions of a minor as being much more mistakes and the result of their age than we would with an adult. Again, I encourage you all to leave comments on this because I'm curious to hear what your thoughts on this whole thing are, because it was shocking to me to hear the judge give that kind of a ruling, especially with it kind of almost seeming to have no appreciation for what is happening with this minor under the circumstances. But, you know, questions that I'm sure are not easily answered and certainly not going to be answered by me over the course of one podcast. But I do appreciate you all being with me for this episode and having this discussion with me. That is our show for this week. We would like to give a very special thanks to all of our listeners and viewers who make this podcast possible and special every single week. As always, I'm your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on all social media at Joshua Ritter ESQ. And if you want to hear my thoughts and coverage on even more true crime cases, you can also check out my brand new YouTube channel, Courtroom Confidential. And as always, you can find all of our Sidebar episodes wherever you get your podcasts. We want to hear from you. If you've got questions or comments you'd like us to address, please tweet us your questions with the hashtag TCN Sidebar. And thank you again for joining us at the True Crime News Sidebar.